What's up, everybody? John the Morgile here. Hope y'all are doing well. Gonna check in for yet another Flat Earth video. I quickly wanted to thank all my Patreon supporters. I gotta say, I couldn't do any of this without you guys. If you'd like to become a patron through Patreon, you can do so for as little as $1 per month to help me continue dedicating my free time to producing new Flat Earth content. Also, if you'd like to support this channel directly through PayPal as opposed to a recurring contribution as is through Patreon, go to www.paypal.me/themorgile, or through Patreon is www.patreon.com/themorgile. Your support is obviously not obligational, as all of my content is free. However, it is the few people in the community who step forward and support when they can that make it at all possible. So in that regard, I want to really sincerely thank Jonathan, Travis, and Chris for helping me get through a recent mini crisis with my computer, which has now since been resolved. I literally cannot do this without the support of the community, as it's obvious to me that YouTube is ensuring that most Flat Earth vids in general just don't get the same promotional priority as other topics like video games, for example, or the latest gossip about one Kardashian's butt or another. So any sort of earnings from advertising on the channel through YouTube is pretty much slim to none. Now, you may say that this sounds like I'm doing Flat Earth stuff for the money, which is the furthest thing from the truth. Prior to Flat Earth, I was doing very well for myself, in fact, and after becoming a vocal proponent for Flat Earth, that has all changed to where I fall way below the poverty line. Yet, I have continued making Flat Earth content for the last 3 years, in spite of the fact that doing so equates to, well, sacrificing my reputation in an era where anyone with internet can find out a great deal about a person, especially one with such an uncommon name as yours truly. Now, I'm not ashamed to be aware and vocal about the fact that the Earth is a motionless plane, not in the slightest, but at this point in the game it's still a cultural taboo, which is frowned upon and laughed at by anyone, well, to be fair, anyone in their right mind with a decent education, or rather indoctrination into the cult of theoretical scientism. Now, I make Flat Earth content because I feel like it's the right thing to do and I enjoy it. At the same time, it does take time, effort, and energy to create videos and do hangouts that is all made available free. And so it is sort of important to have a roof over one's head and some electricity and maybe a dash of internet. Unfortunately, the truth is not a valid form of tender in this world. Otherwise, myself and many other Flat Earthers would be very wealthy indeed. Now, I apologize for that long-winded intro, but I do get quite a bit of angst from people, a few people out there, for mentioning how you can support my channel efforts. Again, my content is and always has been free, so it's merely an option for people out there who are willing and able to help. Anyway, there are a few other people out there who have been very helpful and supportive over the last couple of months, and I got to give a big shout out to all y'all. You know who you are, and it really has just been a tough 2018 and last few months for me and many other Flat Earthers, just generally speaking. So it is nice to see the community come together and help each other out when it's possible. So anyway, this is going to be a relatively short Flat Earth video to address some of the popular nonsensical so-called ball Earth evidence, which amount to frankly nothing more than proof of Glober's confirmation bias due to lifelong indoctrination in the cult of theoretical scientism. Now, today we're going to focus on a couple of arguments which specifically require one to completely abandon common sense, as well as ignore our natural senses and ignore demonstrable reality in order to mold the collective view of reality around the theory that the Earth is a rotating sphere in the vacuum of infinite space. So, in other words, obvious facts which are plainly self-evident are overlooked as a rule, or twisted into somehow being possible upon a rotational spherical world. Over time, such apologetics or theoretical excuses for reality not aligning to the theory of a rotating spherical Earth somehow morph into exclusive proof of a spinning ball Earth. Now, the only way such an overwhelmingly potent mass manipulation of the collective conscious is possible is primarily due to the very young age which we were all conditioned to accept the frankly preposterous theory that the world is a spinning sphere and all of the other ridiculous notions which go along with that theory. So a couple of examples would be of these arguments that I'm describing. One would be, you can see farther from higher, therefore the Earth is a globe. Another one would be, you cannot see the mountains of Colorado from, say, Texas, therefore the Earth is a globe. Another would be, what goes up must come down, therefore the Earth is a spinning globe complete with gravity. And finally, the stars overhead appear to be spinning, displaying some counter-rotation in either hemisphere, therefore the Earth is a spinning globe. So, in all of these examples, it is required that the observer or theorist draw their conclusion that the Earth is a sphere first and foremost, and then back engineer theories, apologetics, and supporting hypotheticals or hypothetical mathematics based on conjecture and assumption with a dash of observational input to explain how certain facts of nature are even possible upon this hypothetical rotating sphere, let alone somehow proof of this hypothetical rotating sphere. So we'll address each of these as quickly as possible, as they are for some reason recurring arguments which still manage to survive in globe Earth terms somehow, in spite of the fact that said arguments are so very elementary and truthfully do not show anything but steadfast, unshakable belief in a spinning spherical Earth, regardless of any evidence presented to the contrary. Now, it is extremely difficult to convince a rational, well-educated person to even consider the truth as a possibility, as the truth simply is not compatible with what everyone was led to believe is reality. So this is a huge problem. There is a chasm between what people believe is possible and what truly is in actuality. And hopefully, this video and others that I've done will help at least one single person take steps towards considering the Earth to be something other than a spinning ball, and to rationally, skeptically revisit the idea that the Earth may not be a spinning ball. So I hope that we can all at least agree on this point. That is to say, it's surely preferable to know the truth, even if it's uncomfortable, unprofitable, embarrassing, or damaging to one's reputation, or even damaging to one's paradigm. Now, as opposed to living in a theoretical bubble of lies, conjecture, and insidious manipulation of our youngsters' worldview posing as scientific fact, it would be preferable to understand the truth regardless how uncomfortable it may be. Now, coming from the globe Earth community, when these arguments used against us during our institutionalized affront of our rational understanding of the world amount to nothing less than circumstantial evidence at best, filled with conjecture and built upon specific axioms which must be granted for argument's sake, but such axioms are never revisited or questioned or examined skeptically to see if they are even, valid or plausible. Now, such a bias towards the theory that the Earth must be a rotating sphere, regardless of the evidence which is presented to the contrary, is so pervasive, if one is honest enough with themselves, to admit that they were convinced under duress that the world is a spinning sphere at a very young age. Beyond that, regardless of one's interest in theoretical sciences, no other definitive or conclusive investigation has ever produced a shred of evidence to support the theory of a rotating sphere Earth. Even if a person goes on to get a degree in astrophysics, they may learn all sorts of interesting theories about infinite space. However, the study of providing conclusive evidence of a spinning ball Earth is completely overlooked and is assumed to be irrelevant, and rarely goes much further than what we learn in high school or possibly even kindergarten. That is to say, regardless of how advanced one gets into theoretical absurdophysics, they will never go back and revisit the underlying assumption that was forced into their paradigm during those formative years involving a rotating spherical Earth. So I would challenge anyone to find a ball earther who has never heard of flat Earth and ask them if they know what the equation is to estimate the expected vertical descent due to geological curvature. This would be something that is rather simple, and if you believe you live on a ball, then you would expect people to know, at what rate would distant objects drop along that curve. Now, such equations and such things on the hypothetical sphere Earth simply aren't discussed, and many sources online actually get the equation wrong, erring on the side of the Earth must be a globe no matter what, of course. So, as all flatties know, the equation is roughly 8 inches per mile squared in expected vertical descent due to curvature. However, many sources online you will find claim it is simply 8 inches per mile, which clearly describes a slope and certainly not a curve. So, it's safe to say that most people, probably even the most decorated astronomers or physicists, have absolutely no idea about the true nature of the static planar Earth, but instead have continued down the garden path to globe land, which forces all observations and experimental data to conform to the theory of a spinning ball Earth, which has been a foregone conclusion in our paradigm since childhood, as opposed to forming our view of reality based on what we can measure, observe, and experience firsthand. This insidious mind control mechanism started very early in our cultural indoctrination in the religion of theoretical scientism, which is the singular reason the ball Earth theory has stuck around for so long. It was forced upon us all when we were simply unable to logically, skeptically review or clearly examine the so-called evidence masquerading as proof of a ball Earth. Now, this bias that was implanted in our collective psyche by the governments of the world, who indeed have plenty of motive to create and perpetuate this deception, it prevents people from seeing the plain and obvious truth. In fact, I don't think that bias is even the right word, as a bias may be overcome by substantial physical evidence or logic, whereas the hypothetical globe Earth will simply never be skeptically analyzed by believers. It is almost a heresy to the cult of scientism for someone to question the globe Earth theory. Now, I must say that whatever their motives and intent, this grand deception has injected a staggering amount of negative influence into the world culture, and they've indeed done a masterful job of essentially putting the world under mass hypnosis, wherein they are clearly looking at a flat, motionless plane, yet everyone sees a rotating sphere, but only in their imagination. So, in terms of the arguments that we're going to address in this video, the first one being, you can see further from higher, therefore the Earth is a globe. Now, this is an argument which comes up a lot and is touted by those who are still in the matrix, if you will, as
proof of a spherical Earth.
Specifically, if you're standing on the beach and watch the sunset, then you get in an elevator to a tall building facing towards the sunset, and you will see the sun yet again after it is set on the ground. Now, this argument, you can see further from higher, proves, well, absolutely nothing one way or the other. Anyone can do a simple experiment to prove this point is completely moot. You know, find a relatively flat, large area and lay on your belly. If you take a note of where your apparent optical horizon is, and then compare that to your apparent optical horizon after standing up, say, 6 feet tall, you'll have a much larger field of view, thus allowing for further visibility upon a planar surface. Such experiments can be scaled down using maybe a warehouse area or even something like a pool table with a small camera, but areas that we know are completely level, thus eliminating the chance of imagined Earth curvature coming into the equation. In terms of how the sun behaves in this example, assuming the Earth is a plane or a sphere, either way, there are some variables between our eye and the source light of the sun which cannot be 100% accurately determined from all locations at all times. So we know for sure that the inbound light from the sun must be refracting through the varying density and temperature layers of the gases above the Earth. Regardless of whether the Earth is a plane or a sphere, that must be the case. Therefore, the sun that we see with our eye is an apparent subjective instance or personal rendering of the source light of the sun for each, distant observer. And the apparent sun could not possibly be where it appears to be, globe or flat, doesn't matter, unless you take into account the accurate amount of refraction and other perturbances that must be going on between the sun and our eye. Now, globe Earth physics indeed has values for all of these different layers, the troposphere, the ionosphere, the magnetosphere, and so on and so forth, although I'm certainly not convinced of those distances. The only thing that I'm, personally convinced of is anything that's involved with high altitude weather balloons, which we can replicate. So anything coming from the likes of NASA, where we know that they've been lying, we know that they've been faking space for, many decades. And so the values that they come back with, frankly, if we can't physically verify them, sure that there are ways to do maybe spectroscopy or some form of radar or such pinging off the different layers of atmosphere or atmosphere above our heads. It is quite possible that the values we're given in globe Earth theory are just massively exaggerated. It's possible. But in any case, I guess my point there is that we can't necessarily use the values provided to us by theoretical physics and NASA in terms of what's going on to the sunlight as it passes through the Earth's atmosphere or atmosphere. And again, we know that the inbound light from the sun must be refracting through these varying density, temperature layers of gases. You've also got the Earth's rotational magnetic field. And that's not a theory. The Earth definitely has a magnetic field, and there is good evidence to support the fact that magnetic fields can perturb light to extreme degrees. So there are variables here that we can't necessarily attest to having all of the values for the equation of doing something like trying to triangulate on the sun. But in any case, the apparent sun, for distant, separated observers hundreds of miles apart looking at their subjective rendering of the apparent sun in their little bubble of atmosphere, that those such apparent suns could not possibly represent the actual position of the sun, and that is whether or not the Earth is flat or a globe. It doesn't matter. The point is, when you watch the sunset at the beach, you're viewing a subjective instance of the sun apparently moving away from you. The operation of perspective will naturally cause the sun to apparently drop towards your horizon or towards your eye level, even though the sun is not actually lowering in altitude. That is an operation of perspective. Furthermore, the effect of refraction, which again is not a theory but a demonstrable extreme variable in what is occurring to sunlight as it approaches the world and thus our eye, refraction will cause the sun to vertically descend further, as the light from the sun would necessarily refract or bend towards the higher density gradient, meaning the sunlight would tend to refract downwards. The operation of perspective and atmosplanic refraction causes the apparent sun to set for an observer standing at sea level. Now, if that observer raises their elevation hundreds of feet, of course they will see further from higher. As your field of view increases, you have a better, wider angle of attack towards the ground at a higher elevation. And so it really is no surprise that the sun will return to view with such a change in elevation after it has apparently set for an observer on the ground level. Now, an observer can see further from higher upon a flat surface, just as an observer could see further from higher on a curved surface. So this so-called argument, which allegedly supports the globe exclusively, is nothing more than a case of window dressing, taking observational data and filtering that through the lens of the Earth must be a spinning sphere no matter what, so any and all natural observations must be exclusive proof for a spinning ball Earth. Now, this may sound a bit cynical or oversimplified, maybe. However, it really is the truth as I see it. For Globers to claim you can see further from higher, therefore the Earth is a sphere, is just absolute nonsense. And it indeed demonstrates the point I'm trying to make with this video, that in order to remain a glober after being presented with the flat Earth hypothesis and going through the natural motions of first incredulity, shrugging it off as ridiculous, and possibly one day actually taking the time to look into it, and I think more importantly taking the time to skeptically and rationally revisit the topic or our underlying beliefs in a spinning spherical Earth, because once you do that as a rational adult, it becomes clear and obvious that what we were forced to believe as children could not possibly be true. Now, another similar argument which seems to continue rearing its ridiculous noggin is the good old you cannot see the mountains of Colorado from, say, Texas, therefore the Earth is a globe. Now, this argument may seem valid, perhaps even a deal breaker for the flat Earth at first, if one doesn't give it any thought, and especially if one refuses to consider the possibility, even if just for argument's sake, that the world may not be a sphere. So the claim that if the Earth were flat, we should be able to see all of the tall buildings and mountains from anywhere on Earth, thousands of miles away. And this is, of course, a complete abandonment of all that is rational and demonstrable. The simple fact is, the natural operation of perspective answers this so-called argument for the globe perfectly, as any object, no matter how tall it is, will eventually appear to merge with the horizon and vanish due to perspective, and this effect must necessarily be exacerbated by the natural atmosplanic refraction process mentioned a minute ago. Now, refraction of the light bouncing off of the distant mountain or skyscraper or whatever, some tall object very, very distant, refraction of that light across the plane simply doesn't allow light waves to travel parallel to the ground to infinity. So not only do you have the operation of perspective, wherein the world around us appears to get smaller and smaller proportionally with distance, and at some point even the tallest mountain in the world, if you get far enough away from it upon the plane Earth, it's going to appear to vanish due to perspective. But then you also must add to this natural operation of perspective refraction. And again, refraction is not going to allow the light bouncing off the mountain to travel parallel to the ground to infinity. And then, of course, you have the fact that the atmosphere plane becomes completely opaque at some given distance, depending on local conditions such as fog or rain, or even on a perfectly clear day. The atmosphere adds up at extreme distances to become an opaque, impenetrable barrier to one's line of sight. So even if it were possible to somehow convince yourself that perspective would somehow not apply to a flat Earth, nor would refraction to light apply in the flat Earth, then you still couldn't see to infinity, or you couldn't see Pikes Peak from Texas, so you couldn't see to infinity parallel to the ground, due to the very nature of the gases which form the troposphere or troposphere, which add up to an opaque, reflective, refractive, physical barrier impenetrable to one's line of sight at a given distance. And again, this does depend on local conditions at the time. So these three factors, again, perspective, refraction, and atmospheric opacity at a distance, when considered as self-evident truths as a whole, they completely refute the notion that the Earth must be a globe because we cannot see, fill-in-the-blank tall mountain from fill-in-the-blank distant observation point. Right? So I think I've heard one of them claim we should be able to see the Eiffel Tower from the east coast of the United States, or something ridiculous like this. I would quickly point out that in this image here, many of you are familiar with, you can see the distant peaks of Ecrins in the middle left of the image, taken from Picta Fenestreus, a total distance of 273 miles away. Now, when you calculate the expected vertical descent due to hypothetical, non-existing Earth curvature, the base of the distant mountain range should be miles lower than the water in the foreground, and the horizon, even from the high altitude vantage point, should cause the top of the Mount Ecrins to be completely obscured by the water comprising the horizon by over a half a mile. Such an observation is excellent evidence supporting the fact that the Earth is in fact a plane, as such a distant peak should never be visible at that distance if the Earth were a sphere with a radius of about 4,000 miles. Now, if you enter this data involved with this shot in terms of the observer height, the distance to the apparent horizon, expected curvature to the between the observer and the target, it's clear that this photo should end the discussion about the ball altogether. Unfortunately for the truth and the benefit of humankind, we're given more apologetics and excuses to explain away this impossibility upon the spherical Earth by the effect of refraction. So it's claimed by globers who always point to the Metabunk curvature calculator and say, see, standard refraction allows for the 273 mile distant mountain range to rise up a total of several miles to allow for the observer to see the mountains, which should technically be totally obscured by the imagined Earth curvature. So by a trick of mathemagic, globers have built in this effect of standard refraction into the curvature calculations, which always negate or neutralize the expected curvature, in essence creating a situation where the spherical Earth will always appear to be a plane due to refraction. That would be regardless of observer height, regardless of distance. The spherical Earth always appears to be a plane due to standard refraction. Now, the problem is there's nothing standard about refraction. It is certainly a variable, and refraction variables certainly could not constantly and consistently create the illusion of a planar Earth if the Earth was indeed a sphere, nor could it create the illusion of distant mountains raising up several miles into the air without inverting like you would expect in a Fata Morgana. And such mountain ranges appear to be solid and perpendicular to the horizon and even silhouetted. I'd really love to see examples of mirages that are actual silhouettes. In truth, refraction should indeed cause distant objects to apparently drop down or apparently lower towards the higher density gradient of the atmosphere plane due to refraction. And certainly refraction should not cause distant objects like these mountains to appear to raise up above the curve of the Earth and cause the Earth to appear to be a plane. What's actually happening is the Earth is actually a plane, and the distant light coming from the 273 mile away mountain range, while it is being refracted over that great of a distance, the observer is high enough up so that you're able to see the entire thing. So if you were standing on the ground at that same location where the observer is, you would not be able to see that mountain range. However, if the Earth was a sphere, the very top of that tallest peak should be covered by over a half a mile of horizon. And so it's claimed by Globers that the operation of refraction somehow magically causes the distant mountains to appear to be visible to begin with, several miles above where they should be, when the top of the peak should be covered by the horizon by over a half a mile. So we must believe that refraction somehow always tricks us into seeing a flat Earth when the Earth is somehow actually a sphere in theory. Now, unfortunately, it appears that this apologetic tactic in terms of standard refraction, which negates the expected curvature very nicely and neatly, mathematically at least, in theory, refraction simply isn't going to cause objects to apparently raise, but should instead cause objects to apparently drop. Because again, refracted light tends towards the higher density gradient medium, and of course, the closer you get to the ground, the higher density the atmosphere plane is. So what we're actually seeing on the planar Earth is light essentially curving over the flat Earth, and not the Earth curving underneath light that always travels in straight lines. Because that has been the assumption, although we know good and well light simply does not always travel in straight lines. And so the assumptions of the Christopher Columbus, who claimed that ships going over the horizon proves the curvature of the Earth, no, all that proves is that people back then didn't know anything about refraction, or if they did, they certainly didn't apply it to reality. And when you apply the knowledge of refraction to reality, it makes perfect sense upon a plane that the sun would rise and set when traveling, laterally overhead. Why ships would appear to go over a curve when in fact they are going across a plane, and it is the light that is refracting downward at a given distance. But again, we're expected to believe that refraction will do the opposite and cause objects to rise up and create this illusion of a planar Earth to all observers under all circumstances. Now, the Glauber argument involving not being able to see to infinity across the plane and the apologetics of standard refraction demonstrate the main premise of this video very nicely, and that is again to illustrate the degree to which common sense observation and natural science must be completely abandoned, or at least writhed to fit one's preconceived belief system involving a spherical Earth, in order to adhere to such a preposterous claim as being exclusive to a globe. The majority of the world at large has been forced to believe in the world's spinning spherical nature during our formative years. They will cite many such neutral, mutually inclusive observations, which are contorted into the illusion of exclusive proof of a ball Earth. Now, even if you can get a globe believer to admit that we have a point here, often like pulling teeth, it is not evidence for a planar Earth, nor is it evidence of a spherical Earth, but it does indeed refute the claim by globe Earth proponents that said observations only work on a globe. So this particular argument is indeed a stalemate, which makes sense in either hypothesis, flat Earth or globe Earth. However, the globe Earth team will parade such mutually inclusive, moot observations into masquerading as exclusive proof of a spherical Earth. Such theoretical acrobatics are indeed a pattern all over the cult of theoretical scientism, and in fact, once a person really delves deep into skeptically analyzing the globe Earth theory and all such exclusive proofs, they will find that every last argument for the globe is no more than smoke and mirrors, preying on the general public's carefully designed inability to see reality. Now, this is a shame, as most people will not go much further than hearing the argument, we can't see the Eiffel Tower from the east coast of the United States, therefore the Earth is a globe, and their research will go no further than possibly Columbus's arguments that the mass of ships go over the quote-unquote curve last. Again, Columbus knowing nothing whatsoever of refraction, and modern science completely ignoring refraction when it goes against the theory of a ball Earth, just as all other evidence is handled. But most people's research will not go any further than that. There's a great wealth of information to be found naturally or online, which supposedly proves a spherical Earth, yet upon detailed skeptical re-examination as rational adults, the notion of such a world becomes increasingly unlikely, to the point of utter absurdity once you've gone down the checklist of about 20 things. What's left is the staggering realization that the world could not possibly be a spinning ball in space. By direct extension, the notion of infinite space goes right out the window with the ball Earth, for if the Earth is shown to be a plane, all of theoretical astrophysics, starting with the Big Bang Theory all the way to LIGO's alleged detection of gravitational waves, all that goes right out the window, as there is simply no theoretical need for infinite space to exist in the first place. Infinite space is theoretical, and it's a theory which only exists because everyone believes the Earth to be a spinning sphere. When we show that the Earth doesn't have curvature, nor is it in motion at all, the notion of infinite space ceases to exist even theoretically. There is no need for it. So in an analogy, this is one I use a lot, if I disprove the Santa Claus phenomenon to you, is it also necessary to disprove Mrs. Claus and the elves and all the reindeer, and including Rudolph and his red nose? No, once you disprove the Santa Claus phenomenon, all of those other bells and whistles, frankly, go right out the window with it. So when you show that the Earth is a motionless plane, then the theories of infinite space and gravity and black holes and the Big Bang, all of that stuff, it just falls apart. It goes right out the window. So once we do revisit these so-called proofs that were forced upon us when we were young and unable to defend ourselves against absurdity, what's left is the staggering realization that the world couldn't possibly be a spinning ball in the theory of space-time, and by direct extension, the notion of infinite space goes right out the window when the Earth is shown to be a plane. The entire origin of humankind and the world itself must be completely revisited in light of just endless mountains of direct, staggering physical evidence proving a motionless planar Earth. Just a few short years ago, I believed wholeheartedly in everything from the Big Bang Theory to the moon landings and everything in between. Now, after revisiting some very simple assumptions that we were forced to believe as youngsters, such as a spherical Earth, when we revisit these topics as rational adults, for me personally, has caused myself and many others to admit that yes, we were indeed fooled, and at this point the motive for the deception is irrelevant, but we will touch on that a bit in a minute. Now, it can be very difficult for people to admit when they were wrong, especially when their id, their life's work, or their reputation are at stake. So I can very easily forgive those who are terribly uncivilized, rude, and hurtful regarding this matter, although at some point, I would beg them to simply consider what we're saying, as opposed to endlessly arguing with anything we say, even if what we're saying is agreed upon by everyone. So you'll find a lot of instances where globe earthers will disagree with flat earthers' claims or statements or assertions, even if such an assertion is widely accepted by all parties. Now, if you find it odd that pretty much all globe Earth believers have no clue what the expected rate of curvature should be for an observer on the Earth, that's a good place to start conversationally. So, like, if I'm talking to someone who's never heard of flat Earth and I just mention to them, do you know what the curvature of the Earth is? And, well, most people probably wouldn't even know what the radius is, allegedly. But certainly nobody would know that you would expect to see 8 inches per mile squared of vertical descent due to curvature. You'd never, I bet you if you polled 10,000 people, you might find one. And we're talking about globe earthers that have never heard of flat Earth. Out of 10,000 people, you might find one who knows that equation. Which is an interesting point. Now, it's claimed by the stereotypes that flat earthers are science-denying idiots who don't understand the standard accepted models. However, this is the opposite of the truth. We, as flat earthers, must necessarily know loads more about flat Earth than your average normal person. No offense, flat earthers. But plus, your average flat earther knows a great deal more about the hypothetical globe Earth physics and geometry than your average glober. And as silly as that may seem, it is, in most cases, generally speaking, the truth. Most flat earthers know more about the heliocentric accepted standard theory than your average person who believes they live, stuck to the side of a spinning sphere in outer space. But most people couldn't tell you how big is that sphere, how fast is it supposedly spinning, how fast is it supposedly orbiting, what is the rate of curvature expected to be on this hypothetical ball. All of that stuff is really quite mind-boggling, Most people who weren't really into theoretical sciences in school or whatever, when you tell them that we're supposedly in motion, spinning around the equator at over 1,000 miles an hour, maybe around 800-900 miles an hour in Florida, faster than the speed of sound pretty much anywhere in the United States, and that's just axial rotation. People find that hard to believe, although they will accept it, because again, anything involving the Earth being a globe is accepted. So even though it certainly doesn't seem as if we are zipping along a curve at over 1,000 miles an hour, or at least faster than the speed of sound, constantly throughout every day, people will believe and accept the notion that that's what's going on. Although when you start getting into orbital velocities, alleged orbital velocities, the Earth supposedly going around the Sun at over 66,000 miles an hour, such numbers are frankly incomprehensible, yet we should experience constant acceleration. We should definitely notice it if the Earth was spinning and orbiting the Sun, which is also, by the way, supposedly in motion around the Milky Way galaxy, and the Sun is, of course, supposedly traveling at a 60-degree angle offset to our ecliptic plane, so you get some very strange accelerations involved with that sort of model. The idea of orbital mechanics, especially when you look at things like the perfect planes of orbit, such as the ecliptic plane being offset to the Sun's path by 60 degrees, allegedly, it just introduces all sorts of problems, which we are not going to get into now, but maybe in another video. But back on point, we as flat earthers must necessarily know more about the globe as well as flat earth than the average globe earth proponent. And that is a difficult position to be in, because if you try to discuss flat earth with newcomers to the topic, you have to sort of talk out of both sides of your mouth, for lack of a better analogy. You have to explain what the globe earth theory is, and then you have to explain what flat earth reality is. And so sometimes you're talking about two different ways to discern the same data, if that makes any sense. So it can just be difficult to switch gears from flat earth physics to globe earth theory and back and forth in order to make a point. But anyway, I digress. Now, one of my favorite arguments, which is paraded around as proof of a globe earth, is the one involving what goes up must come down, therefore the Earth is a spinning sphere complete with gravity. Now, in short, the last thing that one would ever expect when standing perpendicular to the axis of a rotating sphere would be what goes up must come down. Now, of course, this natural, demonstrable phenomenon has been cleverly slipped in as yet another quote-unquote proof of a spinning ball Earth complete with gravity. Now, Neil deGrasse Tyson and others will have trouble explaining what gravity is one day, and another day they will simply release an object from their hand, watch it fall, and call that proof of the theory of gravity. Now, to be clear, nobody is arguing the fact that what goes up must come down. That's generally a good rule of thumb, unless you're talking about helium or hot air balloons. Under most circumstances, here on the physical plane of reality, what goes up must come down. So that certainly is not being argued. The argument here involves the fact that this natural phenomenon should technically, well, not be possible upon a rotating spheroidal world. The theory of gravity was created to explain how this peculiar fact could possibly work upon a spinning ball Earth. So it is claimed that a massive object such as the Earth is essentially displacing the theoretical fabric of hypothetical space-time. Of course, this fabric is comprised of, well, nothing, a vacuum. Yet the planet Earth is somehow displacing this hypothetical fabric, which is naturally rectilinear, and the Earth itself is causing this linear fabric made of nothing to curve around the Earth, thus creating a sort of surface tension, for lack of a better term, which causes objects to accelerate towards the center of the world's mass. Now, there is a bit of a conundrum here, as you must have large, massive spheres to generate gravity, and yet you must have gravity to create large, massive spheres. So it is sort of like, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Which came first, the gravity or the sphere? And I actually did a video of that title not long ago, maybe a year ago. I'll put a card to that right here. It's actually a pretty good one. If you enjoyed this, you'll probably like that one. Now I'll quickly point out that if the Earth doesn't possess curvature, then the idea of the world curving the theory of space-time instantly goes right out the window. Of course, if gravity were a known fact, which is demonstrable by simply dropping an apple, then why has LIGO spent billions of dollars trying to find evidence for gravity waves? A quick search for the total cost of LIGO yielded some interesting results, which I'm not sure what to make of. This is a quote from source Wikipedia. Quote, by mid-September 2015, the world's largest gravitational wave facility completed a 5-year, $200 million overhaul at a total cost of $620 million. On September 18, 2015, Advanced LIGO began its first formal science observations at about 4 times the sensitivity of the initial LIGO interferometers. Now, end quote, I'm curious to know how something which cost $620 million could be called a $200 million overhaul, but hey, I'm just a stupid flat earther, maybe I'm missing something here. But digging a little deeper into the cost of LIGO, it's difficult to get an exact number in terms of how much it has cost taxpayers since its inception. However, since their absolutely ridiculous claim to have detected gravity waves from 1.3 billion years ago has kicked off an increased interest in investors as well as bureaucrats deciding where to blow our money. In truth, LIGO had to come up with something, as they've pretty much accomplished, well, absolutely nothing for over the years. And they're in a very safe position with their claims. There's frankly no possible way to confirm what they have convinced themselves occurred when they allegedly picked up gravity wave signals from a black hole collision some 1.3 billion years ago, therefore 1.3 billion light years away. So it's not like anyone is going to travel back in time 1.3 billion years and then travel to the point in space some 7 sextillion, 642 quintillion, 212 quadrillion, 985 trillion, 138 billion, 690 million miles. Again, that's 1.3 billion light years, 7.6 sextillion miles. Nobody's ever going to travel back in time and instantly travel that distance to confirm LIGO's assertions and conjectures. Now, such pseudoscience, and let's not forget about NASA and all the others, is not only a huge waste of valuable resources, but our very government is taking our tax dollars and spending that on literally misleading and brainwashing everyone about our true place in the universe, which is apparently central, special, and unique. Of course, scientism would have us all believe that you and I are about as significant as a single grain of sand on the beach, potentially leading to all sorts of psychological problems and cultural problems stemming from an extremely low self-esteem or a low respect for others built right into the infinite space hypothesis paradigm. Now, according to the religion of theoretical physics, it really doesn't matter how we treat ourselves, how we treat one another in the world, strip mining the mountains, poisoning and polluting the oceans, etc. Because at the end of the day, nothing we do in this life could possibly have any sort of ramifications in the grand scheme of things if you adhere to a globe Earth infinite space theory. Now, as a globe earther for the majority of my life, I often viewed the rise and fall of ancient civilizations as tantamount to the rise and fall of anthills. The entire theory of infinite space and billions of Earth-like planets out there positions humankind as sort of a random freak of nature with nothing really spiritual, special, or significant about us and our magnificent world, other than our ability to consume and, well, poison the world. Now, moving on to the next so-called argument, which is exclusive proof of a spinning ball Earth, is the stars overhead appear to be spinning overhead, concentric with Polaris in the north, displaying some degree of counter-rotation in the southern hemisphere. Therefore, the Earth is a spinning globe. Now, I'll first mention that this argument assumes that the apparent motion of the stars is exclusive proof of a spherical Earth, just as, well, all other alleged evidence is. While the stars appear to rotate more or less concentric with Polaris in the north, where Polaris is always central to the other stars. Now, in the south, however, no such star or even a single point in space can be pointed to which displays such a perfectly central position to all the other southern stars as we see in the case of Polaris. Now, of course, you would expect to see such symmetry at either pole were the Earth a rotating sphere. However, even if we saw perfect symmetry in this respect, it does not prove that the Earth is a sphere. Now, whether or not the celestial lights in the south more or less behave as those in the north, except in an opposite rotational direction, is quite irrelevant to the discussion as to whether or not the Earth is a ball, or whether or not the Earth is physically in motion. Now, in the simplest explanation, we see the stars apparently rotating overhead, which could be interpreted either one of two ways. Either A, the Earth is stationary and the stars are apparently in motion, or B, the stars are stationary, more or less, and the Earth is in motion. Now, either one of these two interpretations of the observational data are hypothetically feasible. However, only one can be the truth. Now, when experiments have been done, by globe earthers no less, to prove that it is indeed the Earth in motion through the cosmos of essentially fixed stars, such experiments always yield results which are simply incompatible with the Earth being in motion, and indeed show the Earth to be stationary, while the stars are apparently in motion overhead. Now, the cause of the star's apparent rotation could be caused by any number of factors. I will not pretend to know what the stars are or what causes them to apparently rotate, but there are, some potential theories that we can kick around a little bit. Now, the most obvious would be that the stars are actually in motion around Polaris. Now, in this hypothesis, the stars would all be more or less placed upon the same plane or a similar plane of altitude, and some force, maybe some sort of a magnetic force, is causing them to orbit Polaris parallel to the ground upon the astral or astronomical plane. Now, on the other hand, we can't necessarily say for sure whether the stars are actually physical objects, nor can we in good conscience assert that they are actually in motion for sure. Now, this may be delving a bit into the realm of theory, but it is entirely possible that the source light of the stars are stationary source lights, and it is the rotational magnetic field of the planar Earth which is causing the illusion of astronomical motion. But again, this is merely theoretical and is not necessary for the Earth to be a plane, but it is interesting to think about these sorts of things. Now, this claim may at first seem a bit absurd. However, light waves and electromagnetic fields can really do go hand in hand. This isn't a theory but demonstrable reality. Just as metal shavings will adhere to a magnetic field, light waves can indeed be perturbed to a great extent to adhere similarly to a magnetic field. Furthermore, it's quite possible that the stars are not physical objects, meaning the celestial lights may not be bound to the same laws of physics found here on the physical plane of reality. So, while the apparent motion of the stars is touted as exclusive proof of a spinning ball Earth, it must be admitted that there are other explanations which could resolve this issue without the world being a spinning ball. Of course, at the end of the day, if the Earth is measured to have no curvature, nor any of the mind-boggling acceleration necessary in the theory due to traveling along curvilinear paths at just astronomical speeds, and not to mention curvilinear paths which are in constant relative flux to one another, then the world couldn't be a spinning ball orbiting multiple moving points in space. In my opinion, the biggest problem with astronomy upon a hypothetical globe Earth is the pesky facts surrounding Polaris, central position to all the other northern stars for all of recorded history. Now, it is claimed by globers that the Earth's axis is experiencing a long-term wobble, which takes about 26,000 years to complete. Now, this wobble is claimed to be causal of the precession of the equinoxes. So, axial precession is claimed to be causal of precession of the equinoxes, which is a phenomenon that was discovered by Hipparchus and Ptolemy a couple thousand years ago, allegedly, involving which constellations will house the sunrise during the vernal equinox. So it is claimed that the Earth's axis is precessing through this wobble at 1 degree every 72 years. And this boils down to half a degree every 36 years, or a quarter of a degree over the course of 18 years, etc. Now, the big problem is that since the time of Hipparchus and Ptolemy, the precession has indeed continued as predicted in terms of the precession of the equinoxes as visible on the vernal equinox, looking at the sunrise. However, the North Pole star Polaris remains fixed above our allegedly wobbling and arbitrary axis, which should simply never point to the same star, humoring the globe theory. Our axis should never point to the same star for longer than maybe a few decades tops. And again, this is due to the claim that the Earth's axis is going through a wobble, so changing its angle, going, well, not 360 degrees, but wobbling through space in a circular motion. If that was actually occurring, then Polaris would be, or whichever star is aligned to the axis, would be the most obvious case of where you could see this slow change in angle. Now, a half a degree over 36 years doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're talking about extending out that half a degree misalignment, I think it's 2.5 quadrillion miles or something like that they claim to the distance to Polaris. That would be absolutely noticeable because, again, Polaris is central to the other stars. So being in that central position, it would be the most obvious instance where if our axis was wobbling or precessing, that's where you would notice it. It would be very difficult to do what Hipparchus and Ptolemy did, which was observe which stars or which constellations housed the rising sun as only visible on the vernal equinox. So again, we were in the age of Pisces for 2,000 years. Now we are just in the beginning of the age of Aquarius, based on this precession of the equinoxes. So there is something going on here, but it couldn't possibly be caused by the Earth's axis wobbling, because Polaris has been right in the central position for all of known recorded history. This is a huge blow to the heliocentric standard theory, and since the time of Ptolemy, Polaris remains central to all the other northern stars, even as the Earth's axis has allegedly precessed over 25 degrees since that era. Now, if the Earth was indeed spinning upon an axis which wobbles 1 degree every 72 years, we should certainly never see Polaris directly overhead the North Polar axis, central to all the other stars, for the duration of known history. It's simply not possible unless Polaris is arbitrarily traveling to ensure it remains aligned to our North Polar axis. And it would have to be traveling arbitrarily, oh goodness, just millions and millions of light years, over time, to ensure that it remains fixed over our axis of rotation. So, in ancient Latin, the word for Polaris is, well, Polaris, yet some will claim the North Star has changed once over the course of history, without any sort of evidence to support this claim. Furthermore, if we humor the globe Earth theory just for argument's sake, as we do, it becomes obvious that we are simply not in motion as claimed by globers. If the Earth was actually spinning on an axis, and that axis was wobbling or precessing 1 degree every 72 years, astronomy would have documented many, many different cases of central north stars. But in fact, navigators as far back as history goes reference Polaris as the central north star. It has been there as long as history has kept track of that sort of thing. And frankly, that's not possible in the globe Earth theory. It does not work. Yet, we're expected to just abandon all logic and common sense to fit the theory that the Earth is a ball spinning on an axis which is wobbling and precessing. Now, they claim that we're rotating around the Earth's axis at well above the speed of sound in most places and over 1,000 miles an hour near the equator. Ball Earth scientists claim that we cannot detect or experience this alleged rotational motion, as it is low RPMs, and the conservation of angular momentum allows for it without noticing it, all this motion. Now, this might sound feasible without any further inspection. However, it is a physical law that an object traveling at a consistent speed along a curved linear path will experience constant acceleration in the form of angular acceleration. Now, to claim that the spinning ball Earth would be a fixed frame of reference is taking the observation that the world is indeed a fixed frame of reference and forcing that observation to suit one's preconceived paradigm that the world is a spinning ball. In other words, if the world were indeed a spinning ball, orbiting the sun, orbiting the galaxy at a 60-degree angle to the ecliptic plane, and so on and so forth, the last thing it would be is a fixed frame of reference. However, due to the aforementioned indoctrination into the cult of theoretical scientism, we're forced to abandon reason and common sense and our own experiences to suit this absurd theory. This position involves adhering to the axiom that the world must be a spinning ball, then applying observable reality in terms of the stationary nature of the Earth to suit this theory, in spite of said observation being physically impossible upon a spinning and orbiting ball Earth. And this isn't even mentioning the alleged orbital velocities of the galaxy and such, which dwarf the mere axial rotation of the Earth. Again, these would be curved linear paths of orbit at just mind-boggling velocities, thus producing constant acceleration if we are to adhere to the laws of physics as proclaimed by the Standard Model and verified by simple experiment in terms of angular acceleration. Now, you simply cannot call a rotating sphere traveling along a curved linear path around the Sun, which is traveling at a 60-degree offset angle to the ecliptic plane around the galaxy. The entire solar system is allegedly traveling much faster along yet another curved linear path around the cosmos, constituting so much angular acceleration in theory, it's just ridiculous. And to humor this notion involving a spinning and orbiting ball Earth being a fixed frame of reference without any sort of acceleration ever is just takes the cake in terms of these examples where people must just basically gouge out their eyes, plug their ears, and shut off their brains in order to believe that they live on a ball Earth that is in just constant, or should be in constant acceleration, but no acceleration is experienced. Yet somehow the fact that no acceleration is ever experienced is forced into exclusive proof that the Earth is a spinning ball experiencing no acceleration. It really is just a fascinating cultural phenomenon once you realize this. Whoever's responsible is obviously very insidious, but they do know the human mind quite well, and they are able to manipulate what people believe to an astonishing extent, especially in the case of the globe, which again does start at a very young age for most people. But again, in terms of the Earth being a fixed frame of reference, this argument comes up whenever you might point out that an eastbound flight from LA to New York is often, or at least some of the time, identical in duration to a return flight from New York to LA. So it's claimed that a westbound plane leaving New York will continue spinning eastward with the frame of reference as the ground below, while accelerating in the opposite direction as the alleged rotation of the Earth. Now, this stance is completely absurd, as a westbound flight should certainly expect one heck of a headwind as a rule. All westbound flights should. But such westbound flights should be far shorter in duration than their return flights back towards the east. This is owing to the fact that a plane heading west to LA from New York would be accelerating towards the destination, which is theoretically also accelerating towards the plane. The two would meet in the middle in very short order. On the other hand, the flight heading back east to New York from LA would necessarily be racing against the destination. Now, it's often argued that the ball Earth is a closed system and the atmosphere or the atmosphere is somehow fixed to the frame of reference with the Earth. Thus, the jetliner is also fixed to the frame of reference with the Earth by way of the atmosphere. Again, this apologetic excuse proves nothing, as even if we grant this notion of an atmosphere which is magically bound and locked to the ground beneath it, which is hypothetically spinning, jetliners are constructed to reduce drag, maximize acceleration, and can accelerate and operate independently of what's going on the ground below, and certainly can operate independently of what's going on in the atmosphere. Now, surely the overall trends of what's going on in the atmosphere will affect the ground speed of the plane. So if a plane is taking advantage of the winds aloft, those speeds are accounted for, and they will affect the overall ground speed or measurable velocity of the plane. However, it's a physical imperative that if the plane is no longer connected to the ground and indeed can accelerate independent of the ground, opposite the direction of the alleged rotation, frankly, LA should meet the westbound plane in the middle, when flying west from New York to LA, whereas when you take off going east from LA back to New York, the race would begin between the destination and the plane. And any energy that is spent doing anything but accelerating perfectly towards that destination would cause the airplane to slowly slip out of the frame of reference with the ground beneath. So even slight banks, changes in direction, not traveling perfectly in an east to west fashion would cause the plane to go out of whack with the frame of reference of the ground beneath. Now again, it will be claimed that this is because the atmosphere is magically bound to the spinning ball Earth, but again, it does not refute the fact that objects traveling towards one another will meet in the middle before two similar objects racing against one another will meet in the middle, if that makes any sense. So even if you grant for argument's sake that the eastbound plane would not have to race against the destination, which it would, it does not negate the fact that the westbound plane would be racing towards a destination that is trying to meet it in the middle, right? So surely at some point the westbound plane would no longer be traveling east with the destinations on the ground. Indeed, aviation would be something completely different than what it is, were the Earth actually a spinning ball. There would be just tons of necessary steps taken in order to ensure that airplanes remain fixed to the frame of reference with the ground when taking off or when landing especially. Runways would almost necessarily be set up going fashioned perfectly east to west to avoid having to try to land on a moving target. But when pilots are introduced to flat Earth, I think it is a little bit easier for them to realize the fact, because it is obvious that airplanes are in motion above a motionless Earth, and the fact that the flight from LA to New York is often, or at least sometimes, identical in duration to the return flight is very easily honored or honorable in the flat Earth reality. The flights are similar in duration because the Earth is at rest. If every destination were spinning towards the east, you frankly would have tailwinds as a rule for eastbound flights, racing against your destinations, and massive headwinds as a rule for westbound flights, while the destination is racing and accelerating towards the nose of the plane as the plane accelerates west, cutting through the atmosphere, aerodynamics, and the fact that these two flights are often 5 hours and 45 minutes or so going either direction is just damning evidence against the theory of a spinning ball Earth. And anyone who tries to claim that this is feasible on a spinning ball Earth in terms of the duration of the flights being sometimes identical is just yet again refusing to set aside the presumption that the Earth is a spinning ball just for argument's sake. So all of the apologetic excuses prove nothing, as even if we grant, this notion of an atmosphere which is magically locked to the ground beneath, jetliners are again constructed to reduce drag and maximize acceleration. So surely at some point westbound planes would no longer be traveling east with the Earth, and indeed aviation would be something entirely different than what we have today. Westbound flights are often identical in duration with their return flights east, simply because the Earth is at rest. Now, this is a major problem for the theory of a spinning ball Earth, yet again, there are mountains of apologetic excuses to patch this over. That is, the spinning ball Earth's complete incompatibility with reality. For this last section, I did mention there are some motives involved for government and so-called scientific bodies to mass mind control people into believing in the globe. Now, once you realize the staggering truth about the world being a stationary plane, it's an important step to consider the idea that there must be deception afoot to some degree in terms of the government or the military or NASA, amongst other entities. Now, governmental, military, and corporate entities are designed with a great deal of compartmentalization involved, wherein each individual comprising the conglomerate is only focused upon and privy to information directly relevant to their specific function. This would allow for such a deception to go unchecked indefinitely and adequately refutes the argument that a conspiracy of this magnitude couldn't possibly be kept secret by our bumbling government, who can't rightly keep a BJ a secret, or so it would appear, or the idiots at NASA who monkey around in gorilla suits and play ping pong with water while they're in space, allegedly. Now, it's fairly safe to assume that the majority of people responsible for the day-to-day operations of NASA and LIGO and SpaceX, etc., are completely snowed in terms of their belief in a spinning ball Earth, and would have no plausible need to know the bigger picture involving the deception and faking space and the huge dog and pony show that are the rocket launches to nowhere. So if we can assume, for argument's sake, that since we know the Earth is flat and motionless, then there must be some level of grand deception at the upper echelons of entities like NASA, although the majority of compartmentalized individuals working for NASA are sincerely not in on the hoax. Just as a child finding a quarter under their pillow after losing a tooth isn't in on the tooth fairy hoax. Now, we can get past this notion that such a deception couldn't be kept a secret, as great lengths have been met to ensure that the entire civilized world is wholly incapable of realizing or even considering the truth, even at times when it is explained to them and proven to them directly. It is very easy to continue fooling people about the Earth being a globe, since we were already forced into such a belief at a very young age. So it's not very difficult for this deception to be perpetuated, and only a few key players would be on a need-to-know basis of the deception. Now, there are two major motivational factors apparent in the globe Earth deception, and possibly a third that I'll just mention quickly. Maybe it's a whole nother video in and of itself, but the idea of free energy and the electric universe reality, or theory, if you will, is a major affront to the petrodollar. But that really is a topic for a whole video. We'll start with the first pragmatic motive involving the illusion of scarcity. Now, since big corporations are exactly synonymous with the United States government, profits are held aloft by ensuring that any commodity, be it oil, land, or raw materials, appears to be scarce. Now, whenever a commodity becomes over-accessible or floods the market, by the nature of the capitalist economy, the price for said commodity will, in turn, plummet. Now, it's possible, and I believe highly likely, that there is a great deal more to the world than we've been forced to believe. By hypothetically placing us upon a finite sphere, it ensures that we view the world as inescapable and finite, or of a limited capacity, when it comes to raw materials and quote-unquote non-renewable resources like oil, for example. Now, it's well known that the oil tycoons and robber barons of eras gone have been manipulating their way into great wealth at the expense of everyone else for a very long time. Now, the big oil companies who produce prize winners like international criminal George W. Bush Jr., these big oil companies and other similar faceless, ruthless corporations have been in collusion and in bed with international groups connected by entities like the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission, really just arms of the Rockefeller-Rothschild world dynasty. But they've been in collusion to perpetuate this illusion of scarcity in order to drive up profits and manipulate futures markets to their sole benefit. Now, by placing us all on a hypothetical hamster wheel, a finite globe which cannot be escaped and contains a limited amount of resources, the powers which ought not be have a major leash fastened to the necks of the people, and that is by creating the illusion of scarcity, where we must conform to their system as there's nowhere else to go. It's the perfect deception. Now, if it is true that there is indeed much more land beyond what we've been led to believe, this would strike a huge blow against not only the profits of the governments and corporations, but it would instantly unleash the pioneering spirit, which is a natural and inherent aspect of being human. And this natural aspect of humanity has indeed been caged, bound, and gagged, and trapped on a hypothetical sphere, which is a prison for our minds. By placing us on a hypothetical ball, there is profit motive, to be sure. Since the governments of the world are, well, bought and sold and paid for by the highest bidders, leaving us with the illusion of a government which is about as representative as a pack of wolves deliberating with a den of rabbits as to what's for dinner. Now, we're left wide open to be picked clean by deep-pocketed interests with major stakes in perpetuating the global lie, if for no other reason than to continue this paradigm of scarcity. I would venture to guess that the majority of people comprising such corporate entities are also completely unaware of the deception, and only a very small few would be on a need-to-know basis in terms of flat Earth being the truth. We don't live on a finite, limited ball. They would never let that secret out. I think that this portion of the motive is why we see things like the Antarctic Treaty, where it's technically illegal for governments and corporations to tap the, totally virgin resources in the Antarctic. However, I wouldn't put it past them to discover that the Antarctic is being drilled for oil and mined for minerals and or in everything. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if they're already doing that. However, they would never let that be known, as it would totally screw world markets. It would mess up the world markets because, again, world markets are based on the illusion of scarcity. Now, it is plausible to assume that certain secret societies at the higher levels are aware of the deception, because these secret societies do go hand in hand with the government and the corporations which run everything. I'm actually rather convinced that our world is run by psychopaths who have somehow set up entire world systems in order to recognize one another and put one another into positions of power and elevate other psychopathic people into positions of great power and wealth. And it makes a lot of sense when you study up on how a lot of the most infamous psychopaths behave. They just have this urge to enact their fantasies regardless of the consequences, with no ability to feel empathy or care about the consequences of their actions at all. And it seems like some of these psychopaths would get along swimmingly and may even set up systems to promote one another, and maybe through secret societies or other such methods. It is fairly easy to recognize a psychopath, and it seems as if psychopaths would be able to recognize that in one another. It's come out pretty recently that there is a major physical difference in the way that a psychopath's brain behaves over other people. Normal people's brains have a certain connectivity going on when processing emotions, and psychopaths, when their brains are scanned, simply do not display those characteristics of processing these emotions. So there is apparently a physiological or a pathological difference in a psychopath and a normal person, and it makes a lot of sense that psychopaths would be running this world, because look at the state that this place is in. We certainly live in an inverted fascist system that has elements of socialism, has elements of democracy, at least on its face, but at the heart of it, it is a corporate fascist regime that we currently live under. And these secret societies like the Masons and the Skull and Bones are essentially a central hub for all of these seemingly unconnected groups that are working in collusion to maintain the deception and to ensure their profit continues to increase due to the deception. However, again, it is not necessary for everyone involved with these corporations and entities is in on the hoax. In fact, it would be very prudent of these people to ensure that the very few people are in on it, very few people know it. It's like, even if you tell somebody the truth about flat Earth, they don't believe you anyway, so there is a distinct advantage there in terms of keeping the deception going. I mean, it's not very hard. It has a lot of momentum behind it, and until we change the mass indoctrination of our youngsters, it's going to be a very difficult thing to work through as a human race. Now, there is yet another, I would say, more insidious or spiritual motive to the global lie. This quite simply involves a sophisticated affront against humanity itself. Our complex technical society was only made possible by strong bonds of people allied to a just and mutual beneficial cause, where money was merely a vehicle for progress and commerce. But now it is an elaborate Ponzi scheme where a private group of banks masquerading as a federal entity, have stolen the power to issue our currency, effectively giving the Federal Reserve legal authority to counterfeit money and kill our currencies with inflation. Now, by placing the Earth and by extension humanity in the theory of infinite space, the entirety of human history is a relative blink of an eye in the vast and endless universe full of Earth-like planets. This provides people with a platform to disregard the well-being of our fellow people and place personal gain above all else. Now, I can attest that faith is an extremely powerful thing and can even prove miraculous. Faith is a very powerful thing because it is the opposite of fear. Fear would be the firm belief that something bad is going to happen, and faith would be the opposite of that, in a sense that it is the firm belief that something positive is going to happen. But when you systemically misplace people's faith into believing absurd theorem, such as the Big Bang origin of the universe, where everything was created by, well, nothing, a freak accident, and the implied insignificance of the world in the grand scheme of things, this all creates a chaotic, insignificant world, which was created by accident, thus putting humankind in a position that is even less significant than the speck of dust Earth in the grand scheme of things. Now, the fact that the world is indeed central, special, and unique is frightening to science, as well as to people who have sold their soul for a buck. And the world is apparently the centerpiece of the known universe, for lack of a better term. This fact is extremely disquieting for so-called authorities on science and the future of humankind. By placing us on a theoretical ball, it is beneficial to the atheistic, cannibalistic status quo, which will simply never change until people realize they've been living in a fictitious, theoretical version of reality. As the saying goes, perception is indeed reality, at least to the extent that people will only see what they believe is possible. Now, by some miracle, the globe Earth deception is coming apart at the seams, and I think that this can only go in a positive direction because so much negativity has come out of the globe Earth infinite space paradigm that is indeed a religion that does not identify as a religion, but claims to have answers to things like what created the world, where did life come from, and really the explanations that secular science or theoretical science has for such questions must be taken with a grain of salt. Otherwise, it must be taken with a great deal of faith to believe in it. And so when our faith is misplaced into theoretical absurdities, then I think that one of our most powerful tools as a human race has been obfuscated and taken from us. And if we can use our collective faith in a positive way, without the vast misunderstandings underlying every decision and every conversation and the way that we all view the world, I think it could prove to be very, very positive. So with that, I guess I'm going to wrap this up. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. I do want to mention again that this channel is viewer supported, so if you would like to help me continue making videos, your support is greatly needed and appreciated. The best method to support is directly through PayPal. You can do so at www.paypal.me/themorgile, or the email associated with that, or you can email me, themorguile@gmail.com. And of course, if you'd like to become a patron through Patreon for as little as $1 a month, you can do so at www.patreon.com/themorguile. And I once again want to give a big shout out and thank you to my patrons through Patreon. You guys are the best. And as I mentioned at the opening of this video, I couldn't do it without you guys. So, you know, it's been a continuous struggle, but I wouldn't trade any of my experience and Flat Earth, wouldn't trade it for the world. And hopefully we won't have to struggle through all of this for too much longer. I just see more and more signs of the tides turning in the right direction. But I just don't want Flat Earth to be put into the mainstream as something that's going to be debated as a theory for decades. I'd much rather see Flat Earth accepted as a self-evident fact that it is. And I think that, you know, we may see that in the next few short years. So hopefully that's the case, and yeah, I feel like optimism and having faith in positive outcomes is very strong indeed. So hopefully you guys can agree with me. Anyways, thanks so much for watching. I love you guys. God bless you all, and as always, spread the word, spread the world, and peace.